They don't fear your anger. They don't fear your tears. They fear your absence. When someone builds their identity on power over others, losing control over you is a collapse they can't afford. You become a threat the moment you stop engaging, when your presence no longer bends to their narrative. A narcissist thrives not on love, but on attention, negative or positive. It doesn't matter. What matters is access, emotional access, psychological access, spiritual access. The boundary they fear is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with ultimatums or arguments. It emerges through detachment. It lives in your decision to no longer perform. The most dangerous thing you can do to a narcissist is to reclaim your emotional neutrality and walk away from the chaos they orchestrate, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of survival. They fear that moment when you stop playing the role they assigned you. Every narcissist crafts a script. You are cast as the source of their pain, the fixer of their wounds, the reason they suffer, and the one who must redeem it. That script relies on your participation. It relies on your guilt, your empathy, your confusion. It relies on your silence in the face of emotional manipulation. Your tendency to believe that maybe, just maybe, if you were better, calmer, or more understanding, things would change. But they don't change, not because you failed, but because they aren't seeking growth. They're seeking dominance. The moment you withdraw from the cycle, you interrupt the illusion. You see the pattern not as a reflection of your worth, but as evidence of their dysfunction. That shift terrifies them. You've become someone they can no longer influence. And when you remove their influence, they lose relevance. A narcissist's power doesn't come from their charm. It comes from your belief that you owe them something, that you're responsible for their emotions, that their approval defines your value, that you must stay. Because leaving would mean giving up on the relationship, or worse, giving up on your own identity, which has slowly become entangled with their perception of you. This is how they win, through slow erosion, through the undermining of your intuition, through repeated distortions of reality that make you question what you saw, what you heard, and eventually, what you felt. Not all at once, but gradually, until the truth no longer feels like solid ground. Until the only truth that matters is theirs. You don't escape this kind of mental entrapment through confrontation. You escape by seeing clearly and acting accordingly. You escape by building a boundary that doesn't waver under pressure, one that doesn't ask for understanding, one that doesn't collapse under guilt. And that boundary begins when you realize this. Your healing is not something they can participate in. They were never interested in your wholeness. They were interested in your obedience. They fed on your self-doubt because it kept them in control. The more uncertain you became, the more powerful they felt. The more you tried to fix things, the more they shifted the goalpost. The more you apologized, the more they weaponized your vulnerability. So you learn to explain. You learn to rationalize their cruelty. You told yourself they were wounded, that they just needed time, that love could heal what you didn't break. But what they needed was not your love. It was your compliance. The truth is unsettling. It forces you to ask hard questions about who you've been and what you've tolerated. But it also offers something rare: clarity. And clarity is where real healing begins. When you stop taking responsibility for someone else's dysfunction, you start remembering who you were before their version of you took over. The most powerful boundary is not an emotional outburst or a dramatic exit. It is a quiet, unshakable return to self, a recognition that you no longer owe them your explanation, your energy, or your continued loyalty to a dynamic that only ever diminished you. This isn't about becoming hard or unforgiving. It's about becoming aligned. You are not cold for refusing to be manipulated. You are not cruel for choosing silence over chaos. You are not wrong for protecting what remains of your peace. When you stop reacting, they lose their script. When you stop explaining, they lose their leverage. When you stop engaging, they lose the illusion of control and almost. And it's in that silence, in that stillness, in that refusal to return to the game, that they feel something they've spent a lifetime avoiding: powerlessness. They fear you, not because you harmed them, but because you outgrew the role they cast you in. You became unpredictable, not in chaos, but in clarity, not in rage, but in restraint, not in noise, but in grounded conviction. And that is what a narcissist cannot touch. You are no longer within reach. Once you've stepped outside their narrative, the silence becomes your sanctuary, not because you're hiding in it, but because you're learning to breathe in it again. The air is different when you're no longer trying to decode someone's emotional weather. The tension that once felt normal begins to dissolve. You stop anticipating the next shift in mood, the next accusation, the next emotional trap disguised as a conversation. That constant state of readiness, the mental hypervigilance that kept your nervous system on edge, starts to lose its grip. Stillness returns, but not passivity. This is a conscious stillness, a stillness born from knowing who you are, rather than seeking approval from someone who used your self-doubt as leverage. In this new space, healing doesn't feel heroic. It feels unfamiliar, often unsettling. Because before peace can settle in, you face what you've been avoiding: grief. Grief for the time you spent trying to be understood by someone who had no intention of listening. Grief for the version of yourself that stayed too long, hoping for change. Grief for the dreams you built on false ground. You mourn not just the relationship, but the parts of yourself you compromised to keep it alive. This isn't weakness. It's evidence that you are no longer suppressing your truth to preserve someone else's illusion. That grief opens the door to responsibility, the spiritual kind, the kind that doesn't point fingers but takes inventory, not to blame yourself, but to understand your patterns, to trace the lineage of self-abandonment, to uncover the silent agreements you made long ago that led you to believe love required your disappearance. Often, the roots are deeper than the relationship itself. The narcissist didn't create the wound. They exploited it. Somewhere along the way, you learned that love was conditional, that affection had to be earned, that your needs were negotiable. The narcissist stepped into that script with ease. They studied your rhythms, mirrored your hopes, and weaponized your compassion. What felt like fate was really a reflection of your deepest, unresolved beliefs about connection. That realization doesn't destroy you. It liberates you. You begin to see the relationship not as a failure, but as a revelation, a mirror that forced you to face everything you hadn't yet healed. The most painful relationships are often the ones that awaken us spiritually, because they strip away our defenses. They expose what was hidden, and when everything falls apart, you're finally forced to rebuild on something real. This is where faith enters, not as an escape, but as a framework, a way to reconstruct your identity around truth rather than trauma. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "What is this here to reveal?" The shift is subtle, but it reorients everything. Faith doesn't deny the damage. It contextualizes it. It reminds you that your value was never tied to how much someone could take from you and still keep you crawling back. What grows from that is not just insight, it's a reintroduction to the self you abandoned to stay connected. And with that comes clarity, the kind that no longer negotiates with dysfunction for the sake of love. This is what makes your boundary impenetrable. It is no longer something you maintain through willpower. It's something that grows from a changed perception. You're no longer trying to manage the narcissist. You're no longer drawn to the performance. Their charm doesn't work anymore. Their rage doesn't scare you. Their silence no longer punishes. You see it all for what it is, a system of control, designed to keep you spinning. You've stepped outside of it, and from that vantage point, what once felt complicated is now transparent. You don't need to fight. You don't need to explain. You don't need to defend your decision to disconnect from chaos. The relationship breaks not with noise, but with clarity, with the quiet understanding that anything requiring your confusion to survive was never love to begin with. When you carry this boundary consistently, not as a tactic, but as an extension of your self-awareness, the narcissist is forced to confront what they've avoided their entire life themselves. You are their mirror. Without you, there's nowhere to project, no one to blame, no one to manipulate into carrying the emotional weight of their unhealed wounds. They will try to regain control. They'll shift their strategies. They'll alternate between charm and cruelty. But the old patterns won't work anymore, not because they've changed, but because you have. Your transformation threatens their entire system. And in that space between who you used to be and who you've become, you start to feel the distance, not just emotionally, but spiritually. You realize that the connection was never soul deep. It was trauma deep. It fed on your need to be seen and your fear of being alone. But now, solitude feels different. It isn't emptiness. It's presence. God's presence. Your own. It's the foundation you build on when your worth is no longer determined by someone else's treatment of you. This is the boundary they cannot cross. Not because you put up walls, but because you've reclaimed your center. You don't need to ghost them, expose them, or destroy them. You only need to remain grounded in the truth. Their reality was built on your participation. When you leave the stage, the performance collapses. And that collapse is their greatest fear, because you've proven that you no longer orbit around their emotions. You no longer internalize their projections. You no longer seek redemption through their approval. You've shifted the gravitational pull. The game ends, not with confrontation, but with indifference rooted in clarity. That's the boundary they never saw coming. That's the one that haunts them. Not your words, not your anger, your freedom. You didn't beat them at their game. You walked away from the board. And when they look for your reaction and find nothing but silence, they come face to face with the one thing they've avoided their entire lives: relevance in the eyes of someone they once controlled. That's when fear sets in. Because they know what you now understand, someone who has nothing left to prove cannot be manipulated. Someone who knows their worth cannot be baited. Someone who walks with God does not flinch when they lose the approval of people who were never meant to define them. This is the boundary they cannot undo, always. And it changes everything. If this spoke to something buried beneath the surface, if it put words to what you've lived, felt, and endured, then you already know this isn't just a video. This is part of your return to yourself, to your discernment, to the voice you stopped trusting somewhere along the way. Every story of awakening matters. Every soul that chooses clarity over chaos is part of something greater than escape. It's transformation. And that transformation deepens when you walk alongside others who've made the same decision. This channel exists for that purpose. Not for noise, not for validation, but for truth that restores the pieces you thought were lost forever. Subscribe if you're ready to keep walking through the silence, through the healing, through the steady redefinition of who you are when your worth is no longer in someone else's hands. Turn on notifications if you need reminders that you're not alone, not in your grief, not in your strength, and not in your return to wholeness. You weren't meant to carry this alone, and now you don't have to.